Welcome everybody to London Futurists. We've got a panel today of independently minded futurists and forecasters who are going to be commenting on a particular theme. The theme of how can better foresight actually improve the world? Now, in some ways, the world's already in a very good state. In some measures, the world has never been better. And I've listed some metrics over there, which you can see. We might talk about some of them briefly. But at the same time, there are other metrics by which the world has got worse. For example, although it's true that lifespans have increased significantly over the decades, more recently, COVID sent it backwards for a while. And if we look at the lessons that have been learned from COVID, well, actually, we haven't learned lessons very well from COVID. And it seems if there was another outbreak of such a disease, and if that disease was even more fatal than COVID, with a higher rate of fatality, that would be an absolute disaster. It's true that AI is poised to enable more cures, but it's also poised to enable bioterrorism. It's true that we have unprecedented amounts of green energy from renewables, but at the same time, we have a risk of runaway climate change, because there is still, every year, more greenhouse gas emissions than in previous years, with one exception of the COVID year. And there is a risk in the hard to assess, but possibly near future, that the environment will pass various tipping points and plunge it into much faster acceleration. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these. There's a lot more that could be said here in terms of big tech's not only creating huge value, it's part of a race. Some would say a reckless race. Some would say an almost unstoppable reckless race to AGI. But I think you may agree with me on the whole that, yes, there are two perspectives in the state of the world. Some things are incredibly good, and some things are, nevertheless, incredibly risky. So what have forecasters and futurists got to do with this? So I claim that forecasters and futurists deserve at least some credit for envisioning and creating better futures. I've listed a few names here. You might have different names you would put there. Some of these people would describe themselves perhaps as futurists, others wouldn't, but I think that at least some of the time they acted in that mode. We can claim some credit for that. But I think if we look at what futurists and forecasters have said about risks, our warnings have often not been heeded. And the question I'm hoping to address today is, why not? What have we said which has caused the public to typically disregard our warnings and advice? Maybe we've been like the boy who cried wolf when there wasn't really a wolf. And then when we did cry wolf, people ignored us. What have we failed to say? What have we failed to organize? And more importantly, how could our interventions, our actions as futurists and forecasters be more effective in the near future? In picturesque terms, how could we transition from a group of Cassandras, whose forecasts were true but were ignored, to a group of Archimedes? There are some avenues we might explore for this. The wider set of methods and processes that the discipline of foresight can deploy beyond just offering forecasts, the technological tools that could improve decision-making and adaptive responses, the power of narrative in particular to galvanize positive activity, options for enhancing the effectiveness of global institutions, and past examples of when good foresight did improve the world. And yes, we have the option, if we do some of that right, that we will no longer be like this AI-imagined Cassandra with a thick bunch of reports that the rest of the world is ignoring. We'll be more like a group of Archimedes. We won't just be forecasting, we will be offering levers which can push the world onto a more positive trajectory. So having said all that, I'm going to invite one by one the four panelists to briefly introduce themselves and offer their opening remarks before we take comments and questions from the floor. So next up, Rohit Talwar, Global Futurist and CEO of Fast Future.
Good afternoon all. So what I wanted to do before we sort of attack some of these questions about how we do better foresight, it strikes me that we have very different views amongst people in the thinking about the future space as to what Foresight is. London Futurist has a range of incredible meetings, and quite often I would say that the conversations there are in the space of genius forecasting, expert prediction, preferred futures, where people are really arguing for a particular future. And that's one end of Foresight. The other end of the extreme is where we're doing a very structured process to explore options and come up with a range of scenarios. So I thought it might be helpful for those who don't necessarily practice Foresight on a regular basis to just talk to you about what some of that is. My background is I've been working in the field for over 20 years, doing both Foresight research, so a range of studies, and also acting as a futurist, advising clients, delivering presentations. So I do a range of those different things. I don't like to see myself as in the prediction market, because for me, prediction tends to either be right or wrong. And it's not very helpful as something with which to base policy decisions. Organizations tend to want some evidence. They tend to want to understand the alternatives, and more, they want to be able to think in scenario terms and develop leaders who have that capacity to navigate uncertainty rather than betting the ranch on one thing. And we're seeing this right now with AI and all of the research that's coming out of MIT and other places that says the vast majority of Gen AI projects are failing because they're betting the ranch on Gen AI without preparing people to understand what the technology is, to understand the different ways of how you can use it, and training people to really be creative and imaginative in terms of thinking about how they might use the technology. And that's where our challenge is developing people's imagination to think about the future in creative and optimistic ways. And these processes can maybe help with that. So let's jump in terms of what do we mean by Foresight and why should we do it? This is a kind of simple definition that I like to use. I'm not going to read all the words, but it's about gathering what Peremicic would call all those future factors, the things that might shape the future, and assessing them and identifying how they might come together into different possibilities, and looking at how we prepare our strategies for a range of so that we can navigate a range of possibilities and not just bet it all on 18 red. And why we do that is so that we can make better decisions today, whether it's about responding to what might be happening, preparing for what might be coming, or thinking about how we get an advance on our competitors who are doing things in the space. How do we get a first mover advantage? How do we respond quickly? And also, where might we see opportunities that we want to take a lead in? And where are the gaps in the so-called perceived future where we can create the future? I'm going to go through this quite fast because I want to leave lots of time. And then there's a sort of more formal definition, which I like from JRC, which really talks about this idea of three domains. There's futures processes that help us think about the future, that debate it and shape it. But what it's not about is this idea of predicting or choosing which future we think is the right one and then going after it. And so often when we're doing scenario work with clients, they want to know what the most likely future is, or they go for the best looking one. And our view is that the most exciting stuff comes when you think about the most challenging scenarios, because that's where some of the most interesting possibilities emerge. I really like this from Raphael Popper. I'm a bit of a fanboy. I don't know if he's on the call, but he's done a lot of great research in the field about how to use Foresight, ways of thinking about the methods. And he has this, what he calls the Futures Diamond, which lists a whole range of different techniques that can be brought to bear in exploring the future that go from more qualitative to more quantitative. And he's not saying any are right or wrong, but depending on what you're trying to do, you would use different combinations of them, from doing Foresight-led policy analysis to getting expert opinion through to getting some sort of societal assessment. And it's a very useful way of starting to think about this. He hasn't on this diagram got the genius forecasting and expert prediction in there, but that is definitely seen as one of those techniques. And you'll see people like NASA and others get the experts in to really predict what they think is going to happen with a particular field of science and technology because they want to go deep. Right now, some of you may have seen John Carney asking about that in the Millennium Project discussion forum, where he's asking for people who are going really deep in particular fields to give a sense of where those fields might evolve to, given the amount of R&D money being put in and the capabilities that are coming together to pursue those fields. And then there's horizon scanning, which is, if you like, that first stage of the process, or the second stage, which is about gathering information, helping us understand and scan the environment, pull it together. Different definitions. I like the second one, mainly because I wrote it. At the time, it was really interesting. I ran the Foresight program for DEFRA. We had a £10 million Foresight research budget and actually gave it back, or a large chunk of it back, because the organization just wasn't ready to think in the 3 to 5 to 20-year time frame. It wanted to work with things that were relatively knowable. Anything that was challenging tended to get watered down or taken out. So largely there was a so what response to the very large reports that would get generated. And that's one of our biggest challenges, is that making sure Foresight actually does something that inspires, that challenges, that moves people to action, and that we do less and we engage more. And that's a big part of where I think a lot of Foresight is going, is to very participative, very creative approaches, very vision story-led futures. As a typical kind of view of what the Foresight process looks like, this is a great little framework from Andy Hines, who sort of captures pretty well what we're trying to do with most Foresight work, which is start off by saying, well, what are we trying to do? What is the question we're trying to answer? What are the conditions? What is the context in which we're doing this, the challenges we're facing? So we understand the baseline. Then there is that approach to scanning, which might be desk scanning, might be expert interviews, it might be workshops, a whole range of processes through which we are scanning that which we need to know from very local environment right the way through to the global environment. And right now we're with clients who are trying to understand the global environment and literally clueless as to what to do about it, right the way through to, well, what's happening, what are the scenarios for our supply chain, where they might feel like they have a little bit more influence and control. The next bit from there is then, okay, what could these insights tell us about the future? What scenarios might come out? What causal linkages might there be? What are the different possible futures that might emerge? Scenario planning is only one approach. It's probably the most popular. There's one called causal layer analysis, which is growing in popularity, created by Sahel Inyatullah, who's, again, one of the most respected people in the field. The next stage is then say, okay, when we've done those scenarios and we've tested our current strategy and plans against those scenarios, what is our preferred future? What is it we want to do? And then from there, we can design what we're trying to do, prototype it, and then think about how we can adapt it and implement it and embed it in the change process. Another great piece of work, I think, from Raphael Popper again, is this smart futures jigsaw, where he takes all those different techniques and says, depending on what you're trying to do, you would put these together in different mixes, and it's color coded, which doesn't help me a great deal because I'm colorblind. But I'm told by people who can tell the difference between different colors that it's pretty clear once you look at them. And it makes a lot of sense when you look at the pieces that are put together to say, yeah, okay, I get that that's why you would put these together to do some anticipatory futures work, versus what would I put together to do something that helps us create some transformative future possibilities. There's also a lot of conversation about the difference between design thinking and foresight, and a lot of debate about, can design thinking replace foresight? For me, design thinking is very good in the near to medium term in coming up with ideas. And a typical innovation process, we sort of get a divergent perspective first on possible ideas, but the whole goal is to work through experiment down to what might work and implement that, versus a foresight approach, which says actually what we're trying to do is diverge and come up with multiple possible scenarios. and then converge from there back down to, well, what are our strategies, initiative, plans, and projects that we want to pursue from there. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but there is a difference here then between forecasting. If you want to know what the demand might be for cat food in the next 12 months, forecasting is a great technique. Foresight probably isn't as helpful. But if you want to think about the future of pet ownership, then foresight might be a better approach to understand social trends, economic trends, attitudes towards pets, all of those kind of things, the environmental factors. You might move towards a foresight approach. And the thing with forecasts, as I said at the beginning, is they're either right or wrong, or there's a tolerance to them, a bit like prediction. They don't give you the richness of perspectives and that ability to explore different possible narratives and think about different ways in which you might navigate what could be coming, rather than placing all your focus on one possibility. And then for me, there's a set of real acid tests. The first is, can I understand something? When I see a new method, and there's constant competition, and kind of rule one amongst foresight practitioners is that you have to show that your method is different to someone else's. And there's a lot of competition to have the best approach. Inevitably, it happens in every discipline. But the key is, can you as a practitioner understand the method? And more importantly, will the people you're working for who want to do something with it, will they understand it? And you have to think about having less and less time as you go through the chain from your client partner, the foresight team inside the organization, right the way through to the sponsor, in terms of how much time they will have to actually understand the method. And it reduces and reduces and reduces to the point where you might have 5 minutes to explain the entire process and 15 minutes to explain the output. So we have to make it sure that whatever it is understandable and explainable. And then, can you actually use it? Is it workable? Do the steps make sense? Can the people who get involved become productive quite quickly, or does it require a huge amount of learning before they can get involved? And is there a lot of uncertainty about whether they're doing it right? Futures is one of those spaces where, because we're talking about what hasn't happened yet, there's no scientifically proven method. So you don't know if you're getting it right. Unlike, let's say, other fields of science where you can tell whether or not you've got the right answer in an exam question because you're following certain processes, you're following certain accepted techniques. You don't have that with futures. And so, can it be used? Can it be turned into something deliverable, which can be consumed easily? Is what you're going to create with this going to be a value, or is it just going to be another so what, ho-hum, what was the point of that? And in particular, with a lot of the work we do, we're trying to embed capability inside the client organization. We're trying to give them processes that they can use going forward without having consultants or foresight researchers from the outside plugged in. So can it be repeated by them? Is it sustainable as an offering? And finally, is it affordable? What does it actually cost to do this? Not only in terms of the financial cost, but the amount of time involved, not just from the team doing the work, but from the resources inside the organization you need to be involved. We see some processes where it's 6 months of work. It requires regular input from the top level of the C-suite. That only works if it's truly sponsored by the C-suite and they see that really passionate, or they have that really passionate desire to immerse themselves in the future, or they see a burning platform where they recognize that the organization has to engage with this at a very deep and meaningful level. So that's my whiz through. I don't know whether I've done more than 15 minutes. Sorry if I have, David, but hopefully that gives
you've got 1 minute left.
Oh,
and
well,
I'm going to use that 1 minute to ask you a question, which
Sure.
is, I predict that some of the audience will be thinking, gosh, there's rather a lot here. There are so many different methods. The question at the beginning was, how could we do things better? Is your answer, we have to do all of these things? Or is your answer that there really are a few things that could make a significant difference to our effectiveness?
It depends on what you're trying to do, and you would configure your approach accordingly. Sometimes all you need to do is bring a few experts in and have a chat, and that's all you need to get the executives what they need to start a conversation. Other times you need a rigorous rigorous body of evidence in order to underpin decision making. That often happens in government and in regulated environments. So it depends on what you're trying to do. There isn't one process that you can say this will work, or one set of tools, because so much of it is about the people involved, the behaviors, their understanding of the question they're trying to address, and also their ability to change the way they think to explore the future in more open ways and not be driven by that sense of, well, that won't happen, or making their own decisions about what's likely to happen. We saw that with the pandemic. It was one of those once in a lifetime events for most people. And yet within a year, we saw people talking about things that they said would never happen, even though we'd just been through one. And it's that speed with which people go back to the norm that's the challenge. We need to be stretching mindsets the whole time and recognizing in the past, we talked about volatile, uncertain, complex, and adaptive as being forces in the world that are shaping our world, but they were within a box, if you like. They were kind of within confined boundaries. Now, though that box has been truly broken open, we can choose to take over an island of our choice. We can choose to have whichever Nobel Prize we want given to us by the original recipient. We're in a world where everything we took for granted is being challenged. And so we need a range of exploratory techniques, because cultures in organizations also vary dramatically. The attitudes, the willingness to explore, the level of permafrost there is in terms of the mindsets of the people we're working with. And so part of the skill of a futures researcher or foresighter is to find techniques that are going to work with the people who we most need to get engaged and influenced through the process. A key point here is you're not trying to give them the answer and tell them what you think the future should be. That isn't what good foresight research is trying to do. And so it's about helping them get to the answers. There's lots of foresight work.
I might summarize that by saying, don't think a one size fits all. Foresight is not a single method. Foresight is a whole collection.
Excellent summary.
Yeah. We'll come back to many of the points you've raised, but let's continue in the round of introductions. Next up, I'm going to invite Margeret Heath, who is an independent, interdisciplinary cybernetics researcher. Margeret, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Today, I'm just going to be talking about a few ideas. I am the person who's come out of a 15-year hermitage, medical hermitage, and think that perhaps there are some ideas from systems and cybernetics in looking at very large-scale problems, and perhaps looking at how the actual process of foresight might differ. I'd also like to just perhaps look at how some ideas from systems and cybernetics, or thinking in system science, might actually reframe what we think foresight is for and what we think futuring is about. And let me start off this way. For me, the purpose of foresight is to change the initial conditions of the future. That's how I frame this activity today. And in order to do that, you have to actually know the ground state of reality. And so for me, I would say that the system's purpose is flawed. And what do I mean by that? Posit. We find ourselves trapped in what Nietzsche diagnosed as Western civilization's dual obsession. This is a persistent belief in progress coupled with a fear of inevitable collapse. For centuries, we've lived a story that tells us what we can indefinitely convert the biomass of a passive planet into a stock of human work, human ownership, and we've been treating the world as a collection of objects with clear exploitable boundaries. And those are our initial conditions right now. Well, those are our starting conditions. So cybernetician staff at Beer offered a counterintuitive definition of purpose in the sense of not what it wants to do, but what it is doing. The system is doing all of this. And if we look at our current global systems of systems, their purpose is to cause environmental destruction, biodiversity loss, pollution, to change the climate, these are not externalities to generate the economic, social, political things. These are the purposes of the systems, which the systems are faithfully playing out. And all of these things are part of the psychotechnologies that we've invented as human cultures, which are embedded in the biophysics of a living planet. So for me, faith in progress, if you like, faith in progress, if you want to put it that way, it's lost its footing because our linear path has led us into the state of sort of thermodynamic turmoil of our own making, disconnection from living systems so that we actually don't understand anymore what is meaningful and valuable, what really matters to us, what we treasure. And we've decoupled, or think that we've decoupled, or trying to fix the coupling between ourselves and our biosphere. And we're not doing it from within the right logic, the right mindset for that, because we've not changed the organizations of the systems that are producing these purposes. So we'd like to perhaps redefine progress using a systems leverage perspective. So I'm going to argue that what all Foresight activities need to do is actually be able to embrace these extremely wide boundary issues and look at the interrelationships, the interrelational graphs, the interaction graphs between the various systems that no single futuring or Foresight activity can afford any longer to not do this. So I also think that we can massively change our way of measuring things, what we attend to when we talk about progress, and we talk about move away from the sort of more qualitative aspects of having a certain GDP, a carbon count, a lifespan, etc., towards those measures that also include, and those definitions of progress that also include being and doing. And in this sense, I am being rather prescriptive in the sense that I think of what the purpose is to actually be able to generate the sorts of futures that are on the emergent now. That how do we become co-creators in all of this? So when we understand progress as a expansion of a system's capacity to handle complexity without collapsing, then I think you begin to understand why every futuring process has to have that logic built in. Ross Ashby's requisite variety theorem, he's one of the fathers of cybernetics, suggests that only variety can absorb variety. And so if we're actually going to get to any kind of a future without collapse, we need requisite variety. So the processes of adaptation for a complex adaptive system, which selects out certain variety or information in this process of adaptation, also needs to be amplifying and generating other variety, so as to continually meet the variety, the demands of the variety that is of the environments it's embedded in. And we're failing to do that in almost every single foresight and futuring activity we undertake. And that is why we're not turning things around fast enough. So I'm also going to argue that in order to really leverage all of this, we have to start looking at different places to intervene in the system. So, and perhaps the current forecasting methods and prediction methods, and bear in mind here I'm talking more about assemblies and predictions, they tend to look at just adjusting parameters, for example, instead of, we've got to really go very deep to actually deal and get through the polycrises. We've got to go through the metacrisis link. And this has to be built into all of our futuring models. So I think we need to move collectively as species to the level of meaning making, to the level of values and mindsets. Those have to start informing and explicitly informing futures and foresights. So, for example, one of the things that is suggested by John Vervaeke, he's a cognitive scientist and a philosopher, is that we need to move towards what he calls transcendent naturalism, that systems models that recognize that we're a part of nature, that we're deeply coupled, and we have to shift for a different kind of strategy making, a different kind of direction giving and navigation. We have to start setting our compass by the natural phenomena that arise from the collections of interacting agents whose boundaries are not easily discerned and which might change according to context. So the actual act and activity of foresight needs requisite variety. And we need to be able to evolve non-linear processes alongside this. And usually those are the human dynamics, not the models that we're using necessarily. So based on Ashby's theorem of requisite variety, a system's viability depends on the capability to absorb and match the variety of the environment. So if we've got such a large scale problem, we have to scale, and we have to scale foresight and futuring at scale. And I think this is what needs to be done in futures methodologies. So we've got to actually start getting an anticipation mode so that we can act before something happens. And I think that that's a very different understanding of what futuring is, because it's about being right on the edge where the future is busy being made. And so this is how I think if we could get away from this definition of progress as some sort of linear event and actually broaden it out as the capacity to be able to be viable. So I think we need a sort of not just a very deep notion of future, we need a very broad notion of future. And I think we need an entire social process that gets engaged in this activity. So we'll be able to actually place sensors and get information right on the edge as we're busy making and co-creating the future. And I'd like to involve at scale many, 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 many humans to use swarm intelligence for us to actually begin to do futuring and forecasting in a very adaptive, anticipatory way. So that we can collectively build out world models that are so rich and deep and detailed. And we need to be able to hold superpositions of these many, many world models that we're building collectively, creatively, analytically. And I think that this is also where when you look within a living systems design framework, it's quite interesting to then look at what you would do to actually design an infrastructure that allows for these sorts of activities where you can harness the imaginative aspect of the human being, the poetic, the making, the warm data aspects, the sensing that's non-verbal, all of that stuff, plus the analytical power of what AI is going to give us. If we can create these multi-sensory environments which allow us to interact, to organize together, to go through various hybrid experiences as we actually do various forecasting and futuring methodologies, but to do this at scale and right in every single country in some sort of distributed massive network that taps into the social intelligence of the group, that taps into social cognition, into collective cognition, collective futuring. And I'd like to see us make these kinds of environments which would in a sense be habitats for futuring and for foresight activities, and within which you can then proceed to do whatever future model you need to do. So I would like to just finish that we have to be ready to steer and to co-create futures, not just to predict them. So there is this dual tension all the time in time. I'd like to end with a sort of really big challenge that anybody who's trying to do this would face, and it's probably best captured by The National in their song "Walk It Back," where they the refrain apparently originally was this conversation with the strategist in the White House at the time. And the comment was, "People like you are still living in a reality-based community. You believe your solutions emerge from your judicious studies. That's not the way the world works. We are environmental and we act, we create our own reality. And when you're studying that judiciously, as you will, we act again, creating another reality, which you will study too. We are history's actors and all of you will study us." So I thought that was a really good and deep provocation to us as to what it is we actually want when we're doing futuring. Thank you.
Wow, so many big ideas there, Margaret. Building on many big ideas from Rohit. We're going to have a lot to get our heads around. Just before I pass on to Guilhem, one very quick question for you, Margeret. You've spoken about the need for swarm intelligence, building habitats in which we can get this new meaning. What makes you confident we can have a swarm of intelligence rather than what we seem to be having in the world today, which is a swarm of confusion and a swarm of disinformation? Don't know if you can answer that within 30 seconds.
I think that what we've got to do is create the kinds of environments where people feel that they are able to venture into territory that they're not normally able to do. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. So I'm quite convinced that normal, ordinary people who are part of society too have a lot to say and think and make as part of actually helping to steer the future we would prefer, which I think at a meta level, we can probably say exactly what that would be. I think that if we work backwards and then say, all right, how do we actually assemble large arrays of human beings and cluster them locally and actually have them endeavoring in this way? Imagine what we would be able to sense and understand and then make and shape. And I think that you can design these processes in such a way that they become self-modulating. So I think there's an incredible desire to make a better world out there. And aside, when you disappear certain boundaries like nation state, race, culture, people are extraordinary. They're really extraordinary, and you get a resonance effect.
Fascinating. I'd love to continue this conversation, but first we need to feed in two more panelists. So Guilhem is an independent metacognition specialist and narrative engineer. At least that's some of the words I use to describe him. What are your opening remarks, please?
I'm taking a slightly different angle, a narrower angle to some extent. So I'm taking the perspective from more marketing, semantics, systems angle. And I want to question the limitations of foresight, basically. Our opening idea is that as organizations stop looking ahead, they lose vision. And the very popular agility rational leads to a constant rebranding, trend chasing, very hollow discourse, confused plans, and whatnot. And the problem isn't the lack of the will to adapt, it's being confused about what's actually important when it comes to being adaptable. So losing vision means losing your spine. There's a very simple truth that people like von Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, or the great strategists can teach you, which is that it is impossible to reason strategically without coherent intention. Coherence, so being defined also as knowing what you are and what you want. So I'm using the word forecast slightly differently, but everybody uses forecast and foresight in very different ways, which is something I get somewhat into for that. So forecast more as that idea, similarly to Margeret, which is prediction, making charts, and kind of inferring from the past the data of the future. So I pit forecast against foresight, forecast being embedded, quite automated, continuous, operational. It's very integrated in a lot of different parts of organizations, and I'm thinking more larger organizations. And then we've got foresight, which tends to be external, punctual, quarterly, narrative. It's often very much consultative. And so forecast is more narrow and short-sighted. It infers from the past. And as I would define it, foresight is more expansive, integrative, and it tends to focus, of course, it's a set of tools, but it allows to focus on what isn't perceptible instead of just looking at what you're already seeing and trying to track it in the future. And so we've got one that's more operational, another that's more narrative. Foresight can't integrate. It's narrative. Or so what if it's external? Integration barely matters. We need solutions. So I would agree to this, that it's integrations. The fact of not being integrated and being outside of institutions and such means there's a huge latency, which could be 3 months, a year, sometimes much more, sometimes less, but it will lose because the world is changing at a very high pace and it's increasing in pace. And so if the world continues to mutate, we can't really adjust things just quarterly. It's not really sustainable. You need a more fluid kind of process. And so latency is a hard local limit in that context. And then foresight can be seen as a Swiss Army knife. There's many different techniques to it, many different tools. And so I argue that foresight actually has all the solutions and tools it needs to be effective. And that the fact that foresight tends to be quite systems adjacent, there's a lot of different tools that are very much inspired by system think and such. And so it allows to perceive things that cannot be perceived otherwise, at least much easier. And so it's a clear perception upgrade. And so 2 very simple questions, which is how does foresight become integrated? And then question 2, how does foresight gain leverage? Which is the main point of my talk, which is leverage. And so here's a more fun segment, which is the magic of semantic shifts. So in history, you've got quite a slew of words that with time either become completely ubiquitous because they're too trendy and overused, or they become widely unpopular because of historic weight. So if people, my fellow panelists, want to take a guess at certain of those words and how they might become quite different and replaced in the future, I can give you the mic for a few seconds. I can give you hints also. If someone wants to take it, that is.
Well, natural philosophy became science, didn't it?
Hmm? Yes. Any other guess?
Propaganda became marketing.
Yes, that can be one of the interpretations. I'm putting
Physics
it as
became medicine. Yeah.
Physics is medicine. Statistics becomes, so it's the data point I'm putting in terms of timing is more like the moment it becomes dominant, and start defining something very different. And so what all those words have in common, my point is that they all existed. At least you could find other words that have different mechanisms, but a lot of them tend to have the fact that they existed as a subdiscipline. So it was a very specific discipline inside of a larger one that was widely used. They emerged as a very pioneering movement that was really trying to change things and find new tools and such. They tend to be considered as very specific and narrow use. So it is dismissed in many ways by the wider group or field in which it's integrated. And it's highly rich with relevant tools. You could think of something like science, for instance, right? Natural philosophy is this, how does the world work and such? And then science is like, well, actually, maybe we have a method to make this actually good. And obviously it was much more dismissed initially, like, okay, you freaks with your certainty and whatever, we don't know. But then as the world becomes more granular and we've got more data, then it starts making more sense. And so they tended to be convergent with modern challenges and future ones. And the big advantage they had usually is that they had low semantic baggage at scale. And by at scale, I mean that in the field, they might have a lot of semantic baggage where people might dismiss it, but outside of the field, nobody had a clue what it means. So it means it could expand outwards without being weighed down by something, that's the idea. And then the other idea is that the encompassing frame, so for instance, natural philosophy, outgrew itself as it tried to scale with the world. and that it tries to scale with complexity. And so the question is, what is foresight the limb of? Drum roll, strategy. Oh no, what a surprise. And so foresight belongs to the field of strategy, technically. And it sees that itself as, you know, a more like very specific little niche practice where weird people try to practice the future and predict things, and they have all these weird tools. And so the idea is that my point is that the word of strategy has become ubiquitous. It's used everywhere for anything. Strategy this, strategy that. It means marketing. It means practically anything. Sometimes it really means strategy, but a lot of the time it doesn't, which is technically a problem because there's still very much a need for the deeper meaning of strategy. And if the lines is blurred, then there's no problem. So strategy, no. Foresight. And so that would be kind of the idea. I'm putting 2026 as a bit of an inside joke because people in the Futurist tend to be very optimistic about adoption rates. And so I'm making several points here, which is strategy was always narrative. That somebody like von Clowitz was not a KPI freak. It was not about making little boards and predicting numbers and stuff. It's very much like a narrative art of war. And then as complexity increases, strategy becomes more meta. So if I take strategy and I take tribal wars, for instance, initially you've got a very simple set of data. So you can infer most things pretty simply. Then you get large armies. It's very hard to coordinate. There's too much information. So you go into formations, a deeper theory, then introduce, say, telecoms, and then it's information wars. You think Enigma and such things. So the Second World War is very much an information war. And then if we think the current world, high-speed world, then I would say complex as hell. Systems of systems, multi-agent chaos, non-linear world, escape velocity, you name it. It's more and more meta, more and more narrative. And so when chaos is highest, so is the need for internal coherence. We come back to my first point. And so foresight is what? System adjacent, natively long-term, drives into certainty. It maximizes coherence, so it has a lot of tools for that. Perhaps it is under-formalized, which is my own point. Not because it lacks frames and tools, but because it might be a bit confused about what it is. Nobody agrees about what forecasted foresight is, which is already a big tell. And it's not integrated in institution, which means it's another tell, because it cannot be, because it's a bit too... It's not that it cannot be, it has the tools, but because it tries to be everything, that's a problem. It's perception maxing, it maximizes perception. And then because it maximizes perception, it is needed to build systems and governance. That's my point. And so that concludes my idea, which is that foresight main challenge is self-perception and realizing that it has an opportunity, that is to replace strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, lots more big ideas there. You said that foresight already has enough solutions and tools. It has enough that we can be effective. It's that maybe we're not using them well. And the tool that you mentioned most, I think, is not just we need a new narrative, but we need some semantic shifts. We need some new words. And we had new words earlier, or relatively new words. Margaret talked about requisite variety, which is an old word, but maybe we need to hear it more. The swarm intelligence. What is the single new word, Guilhem, or the single phrase that you think most needs to be upheld?
I'm not saying we need new word, actually. I'm saying that we need... that foresight needs to understand that it can entirely replace strategy, and that strategy is, in truth, an exercise of perceiving the world and making sense of it, and then from that perception and that mapping, coming up with solutions. But strategy is very much this long planning and perception. And it's not necessarily the decision making. Strategy might just be the mapping out of what are the choices, and then you make choices within a strategy. with intention and coherence. And I am saying that there's more of a need to be internally coherent as a foresight discipline, but also that foresight can help organization be more coherent and aligned with values by being act on the future.
Thanks. We're going to pass the floor in a minute to the fourth panelist, Isabel Serval, who is a foresight strategist and futures provocateur at Traversing Futures. And after that, we're going to go around again, much shorter, and each panelist will be able to make short comments on things they've heard already or drawing out points from the Q&A if they wish. Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. This is very interesting. I'm going to bring us down to earth, I think. I'm not contradicting anybody, I don't think, but I'm going to take us into an experiment that is more about applied futures. So I'm going to talk about what foresight can learn from user-centered design. So this is a little bit about how we, what Guilhem was actually talking about, but how we can bring it into daily practice. So a very quick introduction is that I'm a foresight strategist, indeed. This is not a contradiction. And also I will also work in user-centered design. So I'm going to draw on that experience. What we often talk about in among foresight practitioners is where foresight stalls, and that is often in carrying it through into implementation. So the strategy might make a lot of sense, it has a lot of actionable items, it stipulates check-ins, and it attempts to build a community of practice even, ideally, that's when it goes really well. And yet, foresight work largely remains ignored, and organizations keep making reactionary mistakes that chase trends rather than making empowered decisions. So we have a lot of reports in the world that aren't acted on. And even you can see, as Rohit earlier mentioned also, what happened in the pandemic is that we did do a lot of foresight exercises to war game what might happen if a pandemic breaks out. And did we actually know what to do when it did? I would argue partially, at best, right? So I'm not going to talk about anything. I'm going to use quite small examples to make it very tangible. For those of you who don't really know what user-centered design is, I'll give a tiny introduction here. So what we call digital transformation is now decades old, about 30 years old. And it can by now teach us a thing or two about implementation specifically, because it's so delivery driven, right? I'm often frustrated that when you work in digital delivery of any kind, it's often so delivery focused that you don't get time to think about anything properly. So you don't get time for the strategy. It's all like, do it now. So I'm going to take what we can learn from that, but not see it as a holy grail. I've worked a lot in government digital services here in the UK and digital service design in general. So think banking apps, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to explore with you, this is an open conversation because I've not tried doing this yet. I've not implemented it yet. And so I'm curious to hear everybody's thoughts. I'm going to explore how user-centered design principles and processes can be translated into foresight, into a tangible practice, and not just a heap of reports. First, I want to draw on a difference between participatory foresight and user-centered foresight, as it might be. So participatory foresight is great. It means that you invite a lot of people around the table, and you allow everybody to imagine possible futures together, right, in various different forms. And this is a group exercise. There is more participatory foresight in the world right now. I love seeing it. It's great for visioning. It's great for creating futures literacy. I'd love to see more of that. That is not user-centered foresight. So I don't like the word user, but we don't have anything much better at the moment. I don't want to say human-centered because you might be designing for nature, you might be designing for animals, you might be designing for planets, you don't know, right? So I'm going to stick with user, even though yeah, I know it's not great. So what we do is we start with user needs first. That is rule number 1 through 10 of user-centered design, is that you stick to that. Designers and researchers start with discovering user needs, and they build prototypes to further research based on real-world requirements. Now, let's explore how this might work in Foresight. So this is a process typically for user-centered design delivery. You go from discovery to prototyping to research to adapting prototypes into beta testing, which is a controlled environment, into live beta. And the idea is that once the prototype is live, you will continuously improve on it. It never stops. It's never perfect. It's never finished. There is no utopia. So I will skip this bit. I think you got the point. I have come up with a little example to see how it might work in Foresight or not. It doesn't work in every single context. It has to be quite applied. So this is not suitable for narrative Foresight, for example. If you want something really far into the future, completely out there, this doesn't really apply. It has to be something that you want to be doing. I took a 15-year time frame to make it not too hard to do, and you can use research groups that are actually alive today to work with. So first, I would say this is the discovery phase. I took the example of secondary school education in 2040. What do we imagine our futures we want those futures to look like? So I'm taking a policy, say we are in the Department of Education. I'm taking a policy, a design mindset here. Step 1 is you start with your horizon scanning. That's not going to change. You do expert interviews, you do a steep analysis, you might do a futures wheel or whatever tool you think is important in this context. And then you start doing futures insights interviews with young parents, prospective parents, today's secondary school children and teachers, right? You always might, in user-centered design, you always want a really broad user group. I might have skipped some out. There might be other really interesting user groups. You always make sure you cover all types of demographics and abilities, so you're not designing for the dominant group alone. And the next phase would be prototyping. So in this case, I suggest that you create a set of rich scenarios as prototypes. So your scenarios become your prototypes. They need to be rich enough to walk people through them so that they can give feedback and adapt them, right? And you take it back to your research participants and you start exploring these scenarios with them. And you collect those insights. And you go on to the next phase, which is adapting your prototypes towards designing a preferred future. So you adapt and enrich these rich immersive scenarios. And you start creating futures personas that you can easily keep working with, because not every time you want to know what people think, do you need to go back to all your research participants. You can use your personas to stress test your ideas. I suggest that you use some strategy tools like a SWOT analysis. This is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and that you start road mapping so that you start looking ahead and very clearly stating what the risks are, what the opportunities are, what you need to avoid in policy, so that you can create recommendations here that support your preferred prototype or future scenario. Then you go into interdisciplinary beta. Here's where we get a little bit experimental, because the Foresight this is where it really strays away quite seriously from just design or policy design or user-centered design. So this needs to be, for example, a 10-year process, because we are designing futures here. Hand-on. So the implementation of the prototype becomes the responsibility of an interdisciplinary policy design and futures team working continuously towards this. Now, these are people who are already embedded. You're not going to separately hire them, right? They're already working on different things, but there's a working group, a community of practice that comes together at set times to say, hey, where are we going with this? How are we working towards our roadmap? Have we put this in place? Have we done that? Is that risk still a risk? So you keep horizon scanning, you keep adapting along the way, and you have like check-ins along the way, and you use your analytical tools. And then your preferred future should launch in those 15 years. That it should have become reality because you keep working on it continuously, and you keep signal and horizon scanning, and you keep improving continuously. So it should grow over time, right? And by the time that preferred future has become some sort of reality, it would have been time to start again, because a new future has to emerge. So that's my initial idea. As I said, I haven't tried it out. I would love to hear from anybody else who has tried something like this out. I wanted to propose something incredibly practical that might take like foresight and futurist design into the actual doing phase. So that's my experiment. Thank you.
Many thanks, Isabel, especially for bringing it to daily practice and to tangible real-world things. But how would your project fare if you're envisioning what secondary school education might be in 2040? How would it fare if you got somebody like me and said all bets in predicting 2040 are way off because we've no idea how AI is going to transform everything in the time between now and then? If I was part of that project, how would you
I hear
answer
betting
that?
and I hear prediction. These are two things I don't engage with, David. So it's a continuous process. So your preferred future would adapt along the way, wouldn't it? Everybody keeps working on it together. And if we say, oh, we envision this is I don't know what that vision is because I haven't done the exercise. I've made it up as we go along.
Thanks. Let's go around again, this time much, much more quickly. And each panelist will have a chance to comment if there's something more they wish to emphasize. There are a couple of questions which, well, Rohit's already been doing a lot of work in the background answering questions, but maybe the rest of you have different answers to some of the answers Rohit's given. One of the questions I quite like is from Alex Shandaroff. What does better mean? Is there any way to justify any particular method to any particular question, given the choice? And one more question is asked by PNJ, in particular to Margeret, but maybe the others can answer as well. PNJ suggests that the cognitive infrastructure available to most people is what's keeping us collectively in its current bad state. What are the changes we can make, again, practically, so that we can have more sustainable thinking about the future rather than being dominated by the things that are most often on people's minds? So let's start with Rohit, who for various reasons may be keeping the camera turned off.
Yeah, my apologies. I took on a wooden bed frame a few days ago, and the bed frame won, so I have a spinal fracture in my lower back. Luckily, nothing needs surgery, but I can't sit for that long. I guess I would challenge the premise that we can talk about better futures. Whose definition are we talking about? We can talk about better governance, better education. There isn't a single standard by which we're trying to judge this. And I think it's more about a better understanding of how to use future insights and how to explore the future is what will be really helpful, whether it's participative processes, whether it's using systems dynamics, using user-centered design as a way of engaging people with it. I think the real challenge is about getting people to think more innovatively, more creatively, to challenge more, and to see the role of foresight in that process of preparing us for a more complex, more turbulent world where there are less answers. It gives us some ways of making sense of what's going on and also making sense of the strategies we come up with so that we can articulate what we're trying to do more effectively by using the future as a reference point. But I think the thing we absolutely have to wean ourselves off is this sense that the future is about prediction or forecasting. It's not. And foresight is not about those things. Those are marketing techniques. Those are things that you might use. They are, prediction for me is the circus act end of foresight. you do that to kind of capture attention on stage, to capture headlines. I remember when I left university, I was told that if we carried on at the same rate, we would have the entire graduate workforce by 2020 would be Elvis impersonators. Those kind of predictions are pointless, and that's a mix of forecast and prediction. We have to get into this much richer exploration of the drivers, of the alternative possible futures that can emerge, and see that almost as a central part of what we're teaching people as a way of navigating our world.
So perhaps the question, what's the best technique in foresight, is a bit like what's the best food or what's the best music. Different music for different occasions, different food for different occasions. Yes, some food is probably better than others. Yes, possibly some music is better than others, but we need to have a much broader view. Margeret, what would you like to add to the conversation?
I'm sort of struck with this notion that there is just this refusal to understand that we have biophysical realities that constrain what is considered habitable on this planet, and that we're willing to divorce foresight and futures methodologies from that biospheric reality. So I'm struggling to sort of see how you cannot make a statement that says there is a certain version or shape of future that is actually more livable. Because otherwise it makes all of our futuring that we're doing now literally just fantasizing, because we just refuse to understand the ground conditions of which we're a part of. And so this is the tension that I think exists in futuring as a practice, because you're wanting to try and anticipate way ahead how things might move out, but you're also wanting a certain a future for yourself. So you've got to bring these two together so that you can actually make a coherent process of inventing, innovating, and so on within the context of these embedded systems, these very, very important coupled systems. And at the moment, what's happening is that we've got the sorts of systems that are actually literally having us use a year's worth of resources in 7 months of a year. So in other words, your entire salary you're using up within 7 months. In some countries, it's within the first 3 months, if you had to think about it that way. So every single act of forecasting, of strategic thinking, of futuring has to actually begin to understand how the very activities that they're engaged with now, the very worldviews, organizing mythologies, the goals that are embedded in the system right now are not shifting fast enough to situate whatever futures they might hope for within the bounds of a habitable climate for most folk. So I think that we have to just face that as the kind of ground reality in all our futures thinking and forecasting, and predicting and everything else you want to do. Whatever methodology and tool you want, you need to understand these feedback systems. You need to understand the lags and delays, that every conceptual world that you build, every psychotechnology that we have is embedded in living systems that have limitations and limits, and we're far exceeding those. So for me, this is actually about this trying to stack multiple temporal references at multiple scale in the entire process of futuring as an activity that you embrace at scale every day within your organization.
Wow, I think you made a very strong point there, that we can do all the exercises we like, but unless they're connected to true awareness of the real challenges facing the environment and humanity's role in it, the challenges faced by our new technologies, which are often on the point of being out of control as well, then a lot of our forecasts will be a little bit like the people when Constantinople was surrounded, when they were debating how many angels could dance on the end of a pin. That may be a bit apocryphal, but there are some important things that we practitioners of foresight absolutely need to get our heads around. Guilhem, I'll give the mic to you.
The way I would approach this idea and question is the whole thing with systems and such and futures and whatnot is that we need to actually work more on complexity and systems, and we need to make it actually viable to do that. And the way we're thinking and structuring institution is making reductionism win out all the time. And so 99% of our most brilliant people are working on apps or narrow science, trying to figure out the most sometimes very irrelevant things just because it's fundable and publishable. And so my take would be that there's a possibility to create spaces, institutions, and infrastructure that actually that makes possible a lot of things. It's not so much about the solutions, it's about making possible the actual developments of those solutions. Because the free market capitalist view as it is, and just competing for things, is not really going to help us think big. We're just outsourcing complexity and large problems to politicians, which, as we all pretty much know, is not going to be likely to solve our problems. And we need quite a lot of brain cells to solve very, very big problems that have very, very many systemic implications and such. We can't just be winging it and then seeing 10 years later that it's not working. We need to actually design things, and there's, if you look at the tremendous amount of work that has been done in systems design and system science, with the absolutely abysmal number of people that are working in there, it should tell you that if we had just double that, it would be, we might solve way more things than right now. And so making sure that the topology of the infrastructure and institution and incentives that we have, and the game theory of it, is actually favoring people to actually work on complex and impossible things that we think are not possible. They're actually fully possible at the humanity scale. It's just they're not economically viable as a very narrow model. But there's plenty of way to organize and to even just slightly tweak the way, you know, money or funding is done for science and such, to unlock a lot of possibility. That would be my mission and crusade.
So if we had more people working on these fields, if we were supporting more people to work on systems analysis and so forth, we could make a lot more progress. But alas, our society doesn't seem to be set up that way. And we don't seem to be winning that battle. Well, let's pass the mic to Isabel.
Yeah, I can respond directly to that, and also to Margaret's point about, you know, the planet needing to support any foresight work that we might want to be doing. At the moment, our futures are in our minds and financially captured by people with the most capital, right? These are largely people who do not care whether we ruin the planet or not in any way. They do not care about a universalist future, whether everybody has equal access or rights to these futures in any way. And it seems to have tipped, well, I don't know, maybe it's always been this way, but people do not believe they have agency over the future because it seems like it's already captured and written by these people, right? And that takes us back to narrative foresight in that sense, because this is, as a foresight community, I think our biggest job is still foresight literacy. It is the understanding that every single thing that we do and say is creating futures. Every time, like we have all these time travel movies where people travel back in time, right? And there is so much panic, like absolute mortal panic. Don't touch anything. Don't change anything in the past because it will completely ruin the future. You will change history, right? But this is what we're doing every day in the present. We are changing the future with everything we do. And yet we stand by and we see billionaires who have incredibly toxic, controlling, disempowering futures in mind. And we're like, oh, well, I got to go to work. I don't have time to think about this. So I think in that sense, in that overall sense of how do we actually have agencies over our preferred futures, is that we need to craft time and space and community to actually allow each other to think about it. We need to talk futures in schools. We need to talk about it everywhere. We have so much work to do.
Excellent. Let's go around again. I'm going to feed in a few more questions from the audience Q&A. So Jody comments that it seems like truly long-term thinking always gets scuppered by political cycles. How do we overcome that? Alex raises the point. He says the great futurists of the past improved the world by firing people's imagination and encouraging positive self-image of humanity. In contrast, lately, we largely share the prevalent, cynical, misanthropic narrative, which rapidly becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Changing the perspective may make it easier to not only get heard over the chorus of doomsday sayers, but actually doing some good work. What do you think about that? And in contrast, maybe there's one more question from Jody. We all hope for a positive future, but do we think being scary will get more results and actions? Are there pros and cons of that? So Rohit, I'm going to throw all that to you for a couple of minutes.
A couple of thoughts. Yeah, we've always talked about the length of term of CEOs and the C-suite as being an influence on how far ahead organizations think, and the sort of quarterly analysts' reviews, and the same with governments, the sort of 4 to 5 year terms. I think that there's a change happening now. There's so much volatility in markets that governments are beginning to be seen as not able to manage the longer term through the current model. And we're starting to see experiments where people are talking about Singapore, for example, things that are external to government, almost as agencies planning for the longer term around education, around infrastructure. And I think we might see more of that. That's the positive sign of hope. I think the next is that, mentioned earlier by people in different ways, the system itself is creaking. We know that the set of assumptions we took for granted are all being challenged, and therefore just doing more of the same or tweaking at the margins, doing a little bit more systems thinking, doing a little bit more risk analysis, doing a little bit more complexity theory isn't going to shift the needle. This is one of those big moments where we almost need a Marshall Plan for society, where we're saying we need to upgrade the thinking and the capabilities of people at every level, their understanding of complexity, their capacity to learn, their ability to experiment. The way we navigate the next few years is critical to the future of the next few generations. And so this isn't just about having better foresight methods, it's about better ways of thinking about our future and equipping people to navigate through it. And then there's a kind of growing understanding that says, okay, better use of futures techniques could help us. There's plenty out there. We don't need more per se. It's fun to create more, but we've got enough to help people explore the future in meaningful ways. It's more about the willingness to engage with them and then use the outputs to actually create meaningful change.
We need a Marshall Plan for society, using some of our methods, but not just, a little bit more than before, in some ways significantly different from before. We may come back to that. Let's hear from Margeret.
Thank you. So I was just thinking about what Rohit said and thought, well, actually one of our cyberneticians staff at Beard has a model, which is a recursive model. And it's a model of how to actually organize for viability. And in its meta system, it has 4 functions, basically. And 3, 4, and 5, the function of system 3 is to model the here and now, to deal with the local and nature of the business of an organization. And then there is a system 4, which is this adaptive, far-seeing, future and then capability. And then there is a system 5, and there's always this dialogue, continual dialogue going on between the future and the present, and the future and the present. But Beer put in an additional system. He put in a system 5, which he called the identity, the value systems, the vision, the policies, who you are. And he said that the function of this system is actually to bring closure to this dynamic between the future and now. And in a sense, you can understand it as your sort of value systems hugging the sorts of choices you're making as you enact what you're doing. So how you're futuring, because you're busy futuring your futuring. And so you need these feedback cycles that Beer suggested that operates within this meta system. And then the system 2 function is actually the coordination that goes down into the purposes of the system, the guts of it, the stuff that actually makes things, enacts things. So that's a sort of model and a way that he would deal with that as a cybernetician, for example, is to look at how you design this meta system and the interactional dynamics that allows it to function optimally.
Feedback systems can change the pace of things remarkably. So
Yes.
we've had feedback systems with the development of technology. We've had feedback systems possibly with climate change, but we could have feedback systems in social change too. If we design things appropriately, suddenly slow progress could transition into fast progress. Fascinating. Guilhem, your comments.
I think I'm only going to say that my take is to increase what is considered possible. Just increase what is considered possible and what is possible to become possible. If you just increase that kernel and that base, and if you make actions to just increase what is possible and it is considered possible by our civilization culturally, it's a cultural thing. But it's also an infrastructure thing. You can't have a culture without infrastructure. Because you can't have a culture of going to badminton if there's no badminton field, for instance. Well, it's a terrible example. Yeah, my point is just increase the range of the possible, and creativity and people will follow.
So we can change the Overton window. People sometimes talk about
Increase
it.
your variety.
More ideas that previously people thought, well, that's too strange, that's never going to happen, and suddenly it becomes acceptable and useful to talk about it.
Yeah, what they think they can even influence in the first place, or what
they allow themselves to think about.
Yeah,
after all, the founder of much of modern futurism, Herman Kahn, his famous book was Thinking the Unthinkable, which meant there were things that people didn't allow themselves to think about, but we actually needed to think about them, otherwise you'd end up in a really bad state.
Yeah. And capitalism is about constraining us in a very narrow thing of this is viable. This tiny window is very viable. The rest is not viable because it's obsessed about optimizing. But
yes,
in the end,
that's Ashby's theorem again.
Ashby's
the viability of a system is if it's got the requisite variety or greater variety environment it has to deal with. And so what's happening right now is we're getting a massive attenuation of our variety. And that puts us in a very brittle, fragile state. We will not have what it is needed to actually increase the variety so that we actually can have viable, non-catastrophic futures. So excuse me to be sort of really quite extreme in that way. But the mechanism is pretty much the same of this requirement for variety, and we're going to have to generate variety in our metaphors, in our paradigms, in our ways of actually conceiving of the world, so that we could actually try and adapt to and change what's going on now.
That may be something we can pick on as a follow-up topic. Isabel, any comments from you to add to the mix?
I'll keep it really brief because I know we're running out of time, but I would just say that concept of expanding what's possible or expanding that Overton window, as we talked about, we can see real life examples in the I would think that everybody thinks it's pretty dystopian, because Trump does this all the time. Just say you're going to invade Greenland, and it's going to be more likely that he's going to get more out of Greenland than he would have got if he hadn't said that. So making those really aggressive, negative threats. But what if we turn that into the positive, right? So what if we expand what is preferable to most people? I would go with the hard principle of negative freedom, as said by Isabel in do no harm. Just stick to that. Do no harm. We cannot decide what everybody wants.
Be a good ancestor.
Yes, exactly. Be a good ancestor. That's such a good principle. And like try and expand that positive Overton window on that side. I don't know what it looks like, but we can try.
Peter Scott is suggesting then we need an anti-Trump. Do you have any anti-Trump in mind?
Multiple
A protopian, like absolutely nothing to do with Trump. Yes.
But no names in particular.
The opposite of Cheeto Satan, what would that be?
Or we could get a different organization of the current system we have so that it behaves differently.
There's people shouting no justice, no peace right outside my window, and I don't know what about. This is fascinating.
We might invite them to join the panel in a few minutes.
That's right.
Now listen, I'm going to talk to the audience briefly for a minute, but then I'm going to come back to each of the four of you, and you will have 30 seconds to suggest what would you think we should cover in a follow-up meeting? Because today we have had a very wide-ranging discussion, and it's been lots of fascinating topics. But if we were going to narrow our focus for another meeting, could you suggest one thing or one area? And whilst you're thinking about that, let me drop into the chat follow-up option, which is, well, there's going to be two follow-up options. One of them is a meeting on a Discord server on Wednesday, when we will have a chance to pick up some of these topics again. You have 3 days to think about what you've heard. And in the course of these 3 days, you may get a realization, oh, actually, this is what we need to say next. So you'll be able to join us there. And in the chat, there is a link where you can join that Discord and then join that meeting at 7:30 UK time on Wednesday. The Discord is still sort of invitation only. It's in an early beta phase. I don't want it to be overrun yet whilst we're still working on the design. But if you click on that, you will get in. There will be another chance to continue the conversation if any of you are still got energy left. After the next round of comments, we'll take a 10-minute bio break, and anybody who's still here will be able, if they wish, to turn on their mics and their cameras and stick their suggestions into the conversation for maybe another 45 minutes. And many of the panelists won't be able to stay because they're all busy people, but one or two of them might. And of course, there are plenty of fascinating insights from the audience, as I can see from the chat. Having said all that, who wants to go first with a suggestion of what we should cover next?
Quite interested to explore how AI could actually help with the analytical aspects of futuring and those model making methods, and how we could actually integrate with the human side in this sort of swarm futuring, if you like, event. I'd be quite interested to explore that and what can be done and what can be brought to increase the variety of the futures that we generate as we're futuring.
AI enabling perhaps better foresight, which, by the way, was one of the themes of a short video that Bruce Lloyd created recently. Some of you may have seen that. I put a link in the latest London Futurists newsletter. There was a brief video there generated by AI, as it happens, which talked about the ways of making foresight better by AI. That was just at the end after a discussion of two different alternative views of foresight. Any other suggestions for what should come next?
We've had quite a lot of conversations here about complexity and systems thinking and systems dynamics. I think it would be great to have a couple of sessions maybe that explore some of these concepts in more detail, to explain them, starting sort of from the basics, taking people further into them, with examples, ideally with practitioners or people in the organizations who've actually tried to use them in business and government so that we have a kind of a practical context to understand where they've been used, how they've been used, what works, what didn't, how people reacted, the education involved, because I think they're so important, as we've heard over the course of the last hour and a half, that getting our heads around that, I think, is really important. And having a variety of voices on that will also be very important. So I guess for the last 30 years, people have been talking to me about systems dynamics and chaotic systems and modeling at the edge of uncertainty. And I kind of feel like we've done better and better work in creating tools, but not necessarily penetrated organizations that effectively with it. You can also look to get David Snowden along to come and talk about some of his Kinefin stuff, which he would shoot you if you said it was about complexity theory or systems dynamics, but it's certainly fascinating.
Sorry, who was that name again?
David Snowden.
David Snowden. So examples of when foresight practices actually did work, in particular in organizations. That's one reason I started my own book, Vital Foresight, with a chapter on the foresight exercises in South Africa towards the end of the last century. And we need to know what has worked so we can be inspired rather than just saying, oh, we never have any impact. Any other suggestions for what we should do next?
I'm lining up with Rohit.
You're lining up with Rohit. Real
Yeah.
examples of where things have worked in organizations or elsewhere.
Yeah.
Isabel, you're giving a
Everything
thumbs up for that as well? Okay. And any other suggestions? So
Not
I want to
related
thank...
to this, David, but just more generally, more and more stuff going on around the future of women and the future of the feminine as two distinctly different things in society. And again, to have a deeper exploration of what that's about, because particularly in the pub group is quite sort of male masculine dominated. And it would be really interesting to bring some of that research and create some kind of challenging debates around that. I think that would be well worth the price of a pint.
I could even suggest that folk go and read a Cyborg Manifesto.
Donna Haraway, is it?
Yeah, that's a lot of fun. It's quite challenging. Stretch your categories, blow your boundaries.
I
Realize,
suspect there's more than one feminine angle on foresight.
right.
Well, these are some ideas. I want to thank Guilhem, Margeret, Rohit, and Isabel for sharing their thoughts on a wide-ranging and challenging topic, but they've all said really fascinating things. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining.
Have a good evening.
Thank you.